Beauty by Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Brought to you by Audio.ai. The nature of beauty is one of the most enduring and controversial themes in Western philosophy, and is, with the nature of art, one of the two fundamental issues in the history of philosophical aesthetics. Beauty has traditionally been counted among the ultimate values, with goodness, truth, and justice. It is a primary theme among ancient Greek, Hellenistic, and medieval philosophers, and was central to 18th and 19th century thought, as represented in treatments by such thinkers as Shaftesbury, Hutcheson, Hume, Burke, Kant, Schiller, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Hanslick, and Santayana. By the beginning of the 20th century, beauty was in decline as a subject of philosophical inquiry, and also as a primary goal of the arts. However, there was revived interest in beauty and critique of the concept by the 1980s, particularly within feminist philosophy. This article will begin with a sketch of the debate over whether beauty is objective or subjective, which is perhaps the single most prosecuted disagreement in the literature. It will proceed to set out some of the major approaches to or theories of beauty developed within Western philosophical and artistic traditions. 1. Objectivity and subjectivity. 2. Philosophical conceptions of beauty. 2.1 The classical conception. 2.2 The idealist conception. 2.3 Love and longing. 2.4 Hedonist conceptions. 2.5 Use and uselessness. 3. The politics of beauty. 3.1 Aristocracy and capital. 3.2 The feminist critique. 3.3 Colonialism and race. 3.4 Beauty and resistance. Beauty by Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Brought to you by Audio.ai. 1. Objectivity and subjectivity. Perhaps the most familiar basic issue in the theory of beauty is whether beauty is subjective, located in the eye of the beholder, or rather an objective feature of beautiful things. A pure version of either of these positions seems implausible, for reasons we will examine, and many attempts have been made to split the difference or incorporate insights of both subjectivist and objectivist accounts. Ancient and medieval accounts, for the most part, located beauty outside of anyone's particular experiences. Nevertheless, that beauty is subjective was also a commonplace from the time of the Sophists. By the 18th century, Hume could write as follows, expressing one species of philosophy. Beauty is no quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the mind which contemplates them, and each mind perceives a different beauty. One person may even perceive deformity, where another is sensible of beauty, and every individual ought to acquiesce in his own sentiment, without pretending to regulate those of others. Hume 1757, 136. And Kant launches his discussion of the matter in the Critique of Judgment, the third critique, at least as emphatically. The judgment of taste is therefore not a judgment of cognition, and is consequently not logical but aesthetical, by which we understand that whose determining ground can be no other than subjective. Every reference of representations, even that of sensations, may be objective, and then it signifies the real element of an empirical representation, save only the reference to the feeling of pleasure and pain, by which nothing in the object is signified, but through which there is a feeling in the subject as it is affected by the representation. Kant 1790, Section 1. However, if beauty is entirely subjective, that is, if anything that anyone holds to be or experiences as beautiful is beautiful, as James Kirwan, for example, asserts, then it seems that the word has no meaning, or that we are not communicating anything when we call something beautiful, except perhaps an approving personal attitude. In addition, though different persons can of course differ in particular judgments, it is also obvious that our judgments coincide to a remarkable extent. It would be odd or perverse for any person to deny that a perfect rose or a dramatic sunset was beautiful. And it is possible actually to disagree and argue about whether something is beautiful, or to try to show someone that something is beautiful, or learn from someone else why it is. On the other hand, it seems senseless to say that beauty has no connection to subjective response, or that it is entirely objective. That would seem to entail, for example, that a world with no perceivers could be beautiful or ugly, or perhaps that beauty could be detected by scientific instruments. Even if it could be, beauty would seem to be connected to subjective response, and though we may argue about whether something is beautiful, the idea that one's experiences of beauty might be disqualified as simply inaccurate or false might arouse puzzlement as well as hostility. We often regard other people's taste, even when it differs from our own, as provisionally entitled to some respect, as we may not, for example, in cases of moral, political, or factual opinions. All plausible accounts of beauty connected to a pleasurable or profound or loving response, even if they do not locate beauty purely in the eye of the beholder. Until the 18th century, most philosophical accounts of beauty treated it as an objective quality. They located it in the beautiful object itself or in the qualities of that object. In De Veritate Religion, Augustine asks explicitly whether things are beautiful because they give delight, or whether they give delight because they are beautiful. He emphatically opts for the second, Augustine 247. Plato's account in the Symposium and Plotinus's in the Aeneids connect beauty to a response of love and desire, but locate beauty itself in the realm of the forms, and the beauty of particular objects in their participation in the form. Indeed, Plotinus's account in one of its moments makes beauty a matter of what we might term formedness, having the definite shape characteristic of the kind of thing the object is. We hold that all the loveliness of this world comes by communion in ideal form. All shapelessness whose kind admits of pattern and form, as long as it remains outside of reason and idea, is ugly from that very isolation from the divine thought. And this is the absolute ugly. An ugly thing is something that has not been entirely mastered by pattern, that is, by reason, the matter not yielding at all points and in all respects to ideal form. But where the ideal form has entered, it has grouped and coordinated what from a diversity of parts was to become a unity. It has rallied confusion into cooperation. It has made the sum one harmonious coherence. For the idea is a unity, and what it molds must come into unity as far as multiplicity may. Plotinus 22, Aeneid 1:6. In this account, beauty is at least as objective as any other concept, or indeed takes on a certain ontological priority as more real than particular forms. It is a sort of form of forms. Though Plato and Aristotle disagree on what beauty is, they both regard it as objective in the sense that it is not localized in the response of the beholder. The classical conception, see below, treats beauty as a matter of instantiating definite proportions or relations among parts, sometimes expressed in mathematical ratios, for example, the golden section. The sculpture known as the Canon, by Polykleitos, 5th–4th century BCE, was held up as a model of harmonious proportion to be emulated by students and masters alike. Beauty could be reliably achieved by reproducing its objective proportions. Nevertheless, it is conventional in ancient treatments of the topic also to pay tribute to the pleasures of beauty. Often described in quite ecstatic terms as in Plotinus, this is the spirit that beauty must ever induce. Wonderment and a delicious trouble, longing and love and a trembling that is all delight. Plotinus 23, Aeneid I3. At latest by the 18th century, however, and particularly in the British Isles, beauty was associated with pleasure in a somewhat different way. Pleasure was held to be not the effect, but the origin of beauty. This was influenced, for example, by Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Locke and the other empiricists treated color, which is certainly one source or locus of beauty, for example, as a phantasm of the mind, as a set of qualities dependent on subjective response, located in the perceiving mind, rather than of the world outside the mind. Without perceivers of a certain sort, there would be no colors. One argument for this was the variation in color experiences between people. For example, some people are colorblind, and to a person with jaundice, much of the world allegedly takes on a yellow cast. In addition, the same object is perceived as having different colors by the person under different conditions, at noon and midnight, for example. Such variations are conspicuous in experiences of beauty as well. Nevertheless, 18th century philosophers such as Hume and Kant perceived that something important was lost when beauty was treated merely as a subjective state. They saw, for example, that controversies often arise about the beauty of particular things, such as works of art and literature, and that in such controversies, reasons can sometimes be given and will sometimes be found convincing. They saw as well that if beauty is completely relative to individual experiencers, it ceases to be a paramount value, or even recognizable as a value at all across persons or societies. Hume's of the standard of taste and Kant's critique of judgment attempt to find ways through what has been termed the antinomy of taste. Taste is proverbially subjective, de gustibus non est disputandum. About taste there is no disputing. On the other hand, we do frequently dispute about matters of taste, and some persons are held up as exemplars of good taste or of tastelessness. Some people's tastes appear vulgar or ostentatious, for example. Some people's taste is too exquisitely refined, while that of others is crude, naive, or non-existent. Taste, that is, appears to be both subjective and objective, that is the antinomy. Both Hume and Kant, as we have seen, begin by acknowledging that taste, or the ability to detect or experience beauty, is fundamentally subjective, that there is no standard of taste in the sense that the canon was held to be, that if people did not experience certain kinds of pleasure, there would be no beauty. Both acknowledge that reasons can count, however, and that some tastes are better than others. In different ways, they both treat judgments of beauty neither precisely as purely subjective nor precisely as objective, but, as we might put it, as intersubjective or as having a social and cultural aspect, or as conceptually entailing an intersubjective claim to validity. Hume's account focuses on the history and condition of the observer as he or she makes the judgment of taste. Our practices with regard to assessing people's taste entail that judgments of taste that reflect idiosyncratic bias, ignorance, or superficiality are not as good as judgments that reflect wide-ranging acquaintance with various objects of judgment and are unaffected by arbitrary prejudices. Hume moves from considering what makes a thing beautiful to what makes a critic credible. Strong sense, united to delicate sentiment, improved by practice, perfected by comparison, and cleared of all prejudice, can alone entitle critics to this valuable character, and the joint verdict of such, wherever they are to be found, is the true standard of taste and beauty. Of the Standard of Taste, 1757, 144. Hume argues further that the verdicts of critics who possess those qualities tend to coincide and approach unanimity in the long run, which accounts, for example, for the enduring veneration of the works of Homer or Milton. So the test of time, as assessed by the verdicts of the best critics, functions as something analogous to an objective standard. Though judgments of taste remain fundamentally subjective, and though certain contemporary works or objects may appear irremediably controversial, the long-run consensus of people who are in a good position to judge functions analogously to an objective standard, and renders such standards unnecessary, even if they could be identified. Though we cannot directly find a standard of beauty that sets out the qualities that a thing must possess in order to be beautiful, we can describe the qualities of a good critic or a tasteful person. Then the long-run consensus of such persons is the practical standard of taste and the means of justifying judgments about beauty. Kant similarly concedes that taste is fundamentally subjective, that every judgment of beauty is based on a personal experience, and that such judgments vary from person to person. By a principle of taste, I mean a principle under the condition of which we could subsume the concept of the object, and thus as infer by means of a syllogism that the object is beautiful. But that is absolutely impossible, for I must immediately feel the pleasure in the representation of the object, and of that I can be persuaded by no grounds of proof whatever. Although, as Hume says, all critics can reason more plausibly than cooks, yet the same fate awaits them. They cannot expect the determining ground of their judgment to be derived from the force of the proofs, but only from the reflection of the subject upon its own proper state of pleasure or pain. Kant, 1790, section 34. But the claim that something is beautiful has more content merely than that it gives me pleasure. Something might please me for reasons entirely eccentric to myself. I might enjoy a bittersweet experience before a portrait of my grandmother, for example, or the architecture of a house might remind me of where I grew up. No one cares about that, says Kant, 1790, section 7. No one begrudges me such experiences, but they make no claim to guide or correspond to the experiences of others. By contrast, the judgment that something is beautiful, Kant argues, is a disinterested judgment. It does not respond to my idiosyncrasies, or at any rate, if I am aware that it does, I will no longer take myself to be experiencing the beauty per se of the thing in question. Somewhat as in Hume, whose treatment Kant evidently had in mind, one must be unprejudiced to come to a genuine judgment of taste, and Kant gives that idea a very elaborate interpretation. The judgment must be made independently of the normal range of human desires, economic and sexual desires, for instance, which are examples of our interests in this sense. If one is walking through a museum and admiring the paintings, because they would be extremely expensive were they to come up for auction, for example, or wondering whether one could steal and fence them, one is not having an experience of the beauty of the paintings at all. One must focus on the form of the mental representation of the object for its own sake, as it is in itself. Kant summarizes this as the thought that insofar as one is having an experience of the beauty of something, one is indifferent to its existence. One takes pleasure, rather, in its sheer representation in one's experience. Now, when the question is whether something is beautiful, we do not want to know whether anything depends or can depend on the existence of the thing, either for myself or anyone else, but how we judge it by mere observation, intuition, or reflection. We easily see that, in saying it is beautiful, and in showing that I have taste, I am concerned, not with that in which I depend on the existence of the object, but with that which I make out of this representation in myself. Everyone must admit that a judgment about beauty, in which the least interest mingles, is very partial, and is not a pure judgment of taste. Kant, 1790, Section 2. One important source of the concept of aesthetic disinterestedness is the third Earl of Shaftesbury's dialogue The Moralists, where the argument is framed in terms of a natural landscape. If you are looking at a beautiful valley primarily as a valuable real estate opportunity, you are not seeing it for its own sake, and cannot fully experience its beauty. If you are looking at a lovely woman and considering her as a possible sexual conquest, you are not able to experience her beauty in the fullest or purest sense. You are distracted from the form as represented in your experience. And Shaftesbury, too, localizes beauty to the representational capacity of the mind. Shaftesbury, 1738, 222. For Kant, some beauties are dependent, relative to the sort of thing the object is, and others are free or absolute. A beautiful ox would be an ugly horse, but abstract textile designs, for example, may be beautiful without a reference group or concept, and flowers please whether or not we connect them to their practical purposes or functions in plant reproduction. Kant, 1790, Section 16. The idea in particular that free beauty is completely separated from practical use, and that the experiencer of it is not concerned with the actual existence of the object, leads Kant to conclude that absolute or free beauty is found in the form or design of the object, or, as Clive Bell, 1914, put it, in the arrangement of lines and colors, in the case of painting. By the time Bell writes in the early 20th century, however, beauty is out of fashion in the arts, and Bell frames his view not in terms of beauty, but in terms of a general foremost conception of aesthetic value. Since in reaching a genuine judgment of taste, one is aware that one is not responding to anything idiosyncratic in oneself, Kant asserts, 1790, Section 8, one will reach the conclusion that anyone similarly situated should have the same experience. That is, one will presume that there ought to be nothing to distinguish one person's judgment from another's, though in fact there may be. Built conceptually into the judgment of taste is the assertion that anyone similarly situated ought to have the same experience and reach the same judgment. Thus, built into judgments of taste is a universalization, somewhat analogous to the universalization that Kant associates with ethical judgments. In ethical judgments, however, the universalization is objective. If the judgment is true, then it is objectively the case that everyone ought to act on the maxim according to which one acts. In the case of aesthetic judgments, however, the judgment remains subjective, but necessarily contains the demand that everyone should reach the same judgment. The judgment conceptually entails a claim to intersubjective validity. This accounts for the fact that we do very often argue about judgments of taste, and that we find tastes that are different than our own defective. The influence of this series of thoughts on philosophical aesthetics has been immense. One might mention related approaches taken by such figures as Schopenhauer, 1818, Hanslick, 1891, Bulla, 1912, and Croce, 1928, for example. A somewhat similar, though more adamantly subjectivist line is taken by Santayana, who defines beauty as objectified pleasure. The judgment of something that it is beautiful responds to the fact that it induces a certain sort of pleasure, but this pleasure is attributed to the object, as though the object itself were having subjective states. We have now reached our definition of beauty, which, in the terms of our successive analysis and narrowing of the conception, is value positive, intrinsic, and objectified. Or, in less technical language, beauty is pleasure regarded as the quality of a thing. Beauty is a value, that is, it is not a perception of a matter of fact or of a relation. It is an emotion, an affection of our volitional and appreciative nature. An object cannot be beautiful if it can give pleasure to nobody. A beauty to which all men were forever indifferent is a contradiction in terms. Beauty is therefore a positive value that is intrinsic, it is a pleasure. Santayana, 1896, 50-51. It is much as though one were attributing malice to a balky object or device. The object causes certain frustrations and is then ascribed an agency or a kind of subjective agenda that would account for its causing those effects. Now, though Santayana thought the experience of beauty could be profound, or could even be the meaning of life, this account appears to make beauty a sort of mistake. One attributes subjective states, indeed one's own, to a thing which in many instances is not capable of having subjective states. It is worth saying that Santayana's treatment of the topic in the sense of beauty, 1896, was the last major account offered in English for some time, possibly because, once beauty has been admitted to be entirely subjective, much less when it is held to rest on a sort of mistake, there seems little more to be said. What stuck from Hume's and Kant's treatments was the subjectivity, not the heroic attempts to temper it. If beauty is a subjective pleasure, it would seem to have no higher status than anything that entertains, amuses, or distracts. It seems odd or ridiculous to regard it as being comparable in importance to truth or justice, for example. And the 20th century also abandoned beauty as the dominant goal of the arts, again in part because its trivialization in theory led artists to believe that they ought to pursue more urgent and more serious projects. More significantly, as we will see below, the political and economic associations of beauty with power tended to discredit the whole concept for much of the 20th century. This decline is explored eloquently in Arthur Danto's book, The Abuse of Beauty, 2003. However, there was a revival of interest in beauty in something like the classical philosophical sense in both art and philosophy beginning in the 1990s, to some extent centered on the work of art critic Dave Hickey, who declared that the issue of the 90s will be beauty. See Hickey, 1993. As well as feminist-oriented reconstruals or reappropriations of the concept. See Brand, 2000, Irigaray, 1993. Several theorists made new attempts to address the antinomy of taste. To some extent, such approaches echo G.E. Moore's: to say that a thing is beautiful is to say, not indeed that it is itself good, but that it is a necessary element in something which is. To prove that a thing is truly beautiful is to prove that a whole, to which it bears a particular relation as a part, is truly good. Moore, 1903, 201. One interpretation of this would be that what is fundamentally valuable is the situation in which the object and the person experiencing her both embedded. The value of beauty might include both features of the beautiful object and the pleasures of the experiencer. Similarly, Crispin Sartwell, in his book Six Names of Beauty, 2004, attributes beauty neither exclusively to the subject nor to the object, but to the relation between them, and even more widely also to the situation or environment in which they are both embedded. He points out that when we attribute beauty to the night sky, for instance, we do not take ourselves simply to be reporting a state of pleasure in ourselves. We are turned outward toward it. We are celebrating the real world. On the other hand, if there were no perceivers capable of experiencing such things, there would be no beauty. Beauty, rather, emerges in situations in which subject and object are juxtaposed and connected. Alexander Nehamas, in Only a Promise of Happiness, 2007, characterizes beauty as an invitation to further experiences, a way that things invite us in, while also possibly fending us off. The beautiful object invites us to explore and interpret, but it also requires us to explore and interpret. Beauty is not to be regarded as an instantaneously apprehensible feature of surface. And Nehamas, like Hume and Kant, though in another register, considers beauty to have an irreducibly social dimension. Beauty is something we share, or something we want to share, and shared experiences of beauty are particularly intense forms of communication. Thus, the experience of beauty is not primarily within the skull of the experiencer, but connects observers and objects such as works of art and literature in communities of appreciation. Aesthetic judgment, I believe, never commands universal agreement, and neither a beautiful object nor a work of art ever engages a Catholic community. Beauty creates smaller societies, no less important or serious because they are partial, and from the point of view of its members, each one is orthodox. Orthodox, however, without thinking of all others as heresies. What is involved is less a matter of understanding and more a matter of hope, of establishing a community that centers around it, a community, to be sure, whose boundaries are constantly shifting and whose edges are never stable. Nahamas 2007 8081. Beauty by Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Brought to you by Audio.ai. 3. The politics of beauty. Kissing sounds nice, but some kisses are coerced, some pleasures obtained at a cost to other people. The political associations of beauty over the last few centuries have been remarkably various and remarkably problematic, particularly in connection with race and gender, but in other aspects as well. This perhaps helps account for the neglect of the issue in early to mid-20th century philosophy, as well as its growth late in the century as an issue in social justice movements, and subsequently in social justice-oriented philosophy. 3.1 Aristocracy and Capital. The French revolutionaries of 1789 associated beauty with the French aristocracy and with the Rococo style of the French royal family, as in the paintings of Fragonard, hedonist expressions of wealth and decadence, every inch filled with decorative motifs. Beauty itself became subject to a moral and political critique, or even to direct destruction, with political motivations. See Levy 1985. And by the early 20th century, beauty was particularly associated with capitalism. Ironically enough, considering the ugliness of the poverty and environmental destruction it often induced. At times, even great art appeared to be dedicated mainly to furnishing the homes of rich people, with the effect of concealing the suffering they were inflicting. In response, many anti-capitalists, including many Marxists, appeared to repudiate beauty entirely. And in the aesthetic politics of Nazism, reflected for example in the films of Leni Riefenstahl, the association of beauty and right-wing politics was sealed to devastating effect. See Spots 2003. Early on in his authorship, Karl Marx could hint that the experience of beauty distinguishes human beings from all other animals. An animal produces only under the dominion of immediate physical need, whilst man produces even when he is free from physical need and only truly produces in freedom therefrom. Man therefore also forms objects in accordance with the laws of beauty. Marx 1844-76. But later Marx appeared to conceive beauty as superstructure or ideology, disguising the material conditions of production. Perhaps, however, he also anticipated the emergence of new beauties, available to all both as makers and appreciators in socialism. Capitalism, of course, uses beauty, at times with complete self-consciousness, to manipulate people into buying things. Many Marxists believe that the arts must be turned from providing fripperies to the privileged, or advertising that helps make them wealthier, to showing the dark realities of capitalism, as in the American Ashkin School, for example, and articulating an inspiring communist future. Stalinist socialist realism consciously repudiates the aestheticized beauties of post-impressionist and abstract painting, for example. It has urgent social tasks to perform. See Baun and Lanfranconi 2012. But the critique tended at times to generalize to all sorts of beauty, as luxury, as seduction, as disguise and oppression. The artist Max Ernst, 1891–1976, having survived the First World War, wrote this about the radical artists of the early century. To us, Dada was above all a moral reaction. Our rage aimed at total subversion. A horrible feudal war had robbed us of 5 years of our existence. We had experienced the collapse into ridicule and shame of everything represented to us as just, true, and beautiful. My works of that period were not meant to attract, but to make people scream. Quoted in Danto 2003-49. Theodor Adorno, in his book Aesthetic Theory, wrote that one symptom of oppression is that oppressed groups and cultures are regarded as uncouth, dirty, ragged, in short, that poverty is ugly. It is art's obligation, he wrote, to show this ugliness, imposed on people by an unjust system, clearly and without flinching, rather to distract people by beauty from the brutal realities of capitalism. Art must take up the cause of what is proscribed as ugly, though no longer to integrate or mitigate it or reconcile it with its own existence, Adorno wrote. Rather, in the ugly, art must denounce the world that creates and reproduces the ugly in its own image. Adorno, 1970, 48-9. The political entanglements of beauty tend to throw into question various of the traditional theories. For example, the purity and transcendence associated with the essence of beauty in the realm of the forms seems irrelevant, as beauty shows its centrality to politics and commerce, to concrete dimensions of oppression. The austere formalism of the classical conception, for example, seems neither here nor there when the building process is brutally exploitative. 3.2 The feminist critique. As we have seen, the association of beauty with the erotic is proverbial from Sappho, and is emphasized relentlessly by figures such as Burke and Nahamas. But the erotic is not a neutral or universal site, and we need to ask whose sexuality is in play in the history of beauty, with what effects. This history, particularly in the West, and as many feminist theorists and historians have emphasized, is associated with the objectification and exploitation of women. Feminists beginning in the 19th century gave fundamental critiques of the use of beauty as a set of norms to control women's bodies, or to constrain their self-presentation, and even their self-image in profound and disabling ways. See Wollstonecraft, 1792, Grimke, 1837. In patriarchal society, as Catherine MacKinnon puts it, the content of sexuality is the gaze that constructs women as objects for male pleasure. I draw on pornography for its form and content, she continues, describing her treatment of the subject, for the gaze that eroticizes the despised, the demeaned, the accessible, the there-to-be-used, the servile, the childlike, the passive, and the animal. That is the content of sexuality that defines gender female in this culture, and visual thingification is its method. MacKinnon, 1987, 53-4. Laura Mulvey, in Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, reaches one variety of radical critique and conclusion. It is said that analyzing pleasure or beauty destroys it. That is the intention of this article. Mulvey, 1975-60. Mulvey's psychoanalytic treatment was focused on the scopophilia, a Freudian term denoting neurotic sexual pleasure configured around looking, of Hollywood films, in which men appeared as protagonists, and women as decorative or sexual objects for the pleasure of the male characters and male audience members. She locates beauty at the heart of our oppression, and she appears to have a hedonist conception of it. Beauty engenders pleasure. But some pleasures, like some kisses, are sadistic or exploitative at the individual and at the societal level. Art historians such as Linda Nochlin, 1988, and Griselda Pollock, 1987, brought such insights to bear on the history of painting, for example, where the scopophilia is all too evident in famous nudes, such as Titian's Venus of Urbino, or Velázquez's Rokeby Venus, which a feminist slashed with knife in 1914 because she didn't like the way men gawked at it. Feminists such as Naomi Wolf in her book The Beauty Myth generalized such insights into a critique of the ways women are represented throughout Western popular culture, in advertising, for example, or music videos. Such practices have the effect of constraining women to certain acceptable ways of presenting themselves publicly, which in turn greatly constrains how seriously they are taken, or how much of themselves they can express in public space. As have many other commentators, Wolf connects the representation of the beautiful female body in Western high art, but especially in popular culture, to eating disorders and many other self-destructive behaviors, and indicates that a real overturning of gender hierarchy will require deeply reconstruing the concept of beauty. The demand on women to create a beautiful self-presentation by male standards, Wolf argues, fundamentally compromises women's action and self-understanding, and makes fully human relationships between men and women difficult or impossible. In this, Wolf follows, among others, the French thinker Luce Irigaray, who wrote that female beauty is always considered as finery, ultimately designed to attract the other into the self. It is almost never perceived as a manifestation of, an appearance of, a phenomenon expressive of interiority, whether of love, of thought, of flesh. We look at ourselves in the mirror to please someone, rarely to interrogate the state of our body or our spirit, rarely for ourselves and in search of our becoming. Quoted in Robinson 2230. Sex is held hostage by beauty, Woolf remarks, and its ransom terms are engraved in girls' minds early and deeply with instruments more beautiful than those which advertisers or pornographers know how to use: literature, poetry, painting, and film. Woolf 1991 f. 157. 3.3 Colonialism and Race. Early in the 20th century, Black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey (1887–1940) described European or white standards of beauty as a deep dimension of oppression, quite similarly to the way Naomi Wolf describes beauty standards for women. These standards are relentlessly reinforced in authoritative images, but they are incompatible with black skin, black bodies, and also traditional African ways of understanding human beauty. White standards of beauty, Garvey argued, devalue black bodies. The truly oppressive aspects of such norms can be seen in the way they induce self-alienation, as Woolf argues with regard to sexualized images of women. Some of us in America, the West Indies, and Africa believe that the nearer we approach the white man in color, the greater our social standing and privilege, he wrote. Garvey 1925, 1986, 56. He condemns skin bleaching and hair straightening as ways that black people are taught to devalue themselves by white standards of beauty. And he connects such standards to colorism or prejudice in the African American community toward darker-skinned black people. Such observations suggest some of the strengths of cultural relativism as opposed to subjectivism or universalism. Standards of beauty appear in this picture not to be idiosyncratic to individuals, nor to be universal among all people, but to be tied to group identities and to oppression and resistance. In his autobiography, Malcolm X, 1925–1965, whose parents were activists in the Garvey movement, describes conking or straightening his hair with lye products as a young man. "This was my first really big step towards self-degradation," he writes, "when I endured all of that pain, literally burning my flesh to have it look like a white man's hair. I had joined that multitude of Negro men and women in America who are brainwashed into believing that black people are inferior and white people superior, that they will even violate and mutilate their God-created bodies to try to look pretty by white standards." X 1964, 56-7. For both Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X, a key moment in the transformation of racial oppression would be the affirmation of standards of black beauty that are not parasitic on white standards, and hence not directly involved in racial oppression. This was systematically developed after Malcolm's death in the natural hairstyles and African fabrics in the Black Power movement. Certainly, people have many motivations for straightening or coloring their hair, for example. But the critical examination of the racial content of beauty norms was a key moment in black liberation movements, many of which, around 1970, coalesced around the slogan, "Black is beautiful." These are critiques of specific standards of beauty. They are also tributes to beauty's power. Imposing standards of beauty on non-Western cultures, and in particular, misappropriating standards of beauty and beautiful objects from them, formed one of the most complex strategies of colonialism. Edward Said famously termed this dynamic Orientalism. Novelists such as Nerval and Kipling, and painters such as Delacroix and Picasso, he argued, used motifs drawn from Asian and African cultures, treating them as exotic insertions into Western arts. Such writers and artists might even have understood themselves to be celebrating the cultures they depicted in pictures of Arabian warriors or African masks. But they used this imagery precisely in relation to Western art history. They distorted what they appropriated. Being a white man, in short, Wright said, was a very concrete manner of being in the world, a way of taking hold of reality, language, and thought. It made a specific style possible, said 1978, 227. This style might be encapsulated in the outfits of colonial governors and their mansions. But it was also typified by an appropriative appreciation of savage arts and exotic beauties, which were of course not savage or exotic in their own context. Even in cases where the beauty of such objects was celebrated, the appreciation was mixed with condescension and misapprehension, and also associated with stripping colonial possessions of their most beautiful objects, as Europeans understood beauty, shipping them back to the British Museum, for example. Now some beautiful objects, looted in colonialism, are being returned to their points of origin. See Mathis 2017. But many others remain in dispute. 3.4 Beauty and resistance. However, if beauty has been an element in various forms of oppression, it has also been an element in various forms of resistance, as the slogan, "Black is beautiful," suggests. The most compelling responses to oppressive standards and uses of beauty have given rise to what might be termed counter-beauties. When fighting discrimination against people with disabilities, for example, one may decry the oppressive norms that regard disabled bodies as ugly and leave it at that. Or one might try to discover what new standards of beauty and subversive pleasures might arise in the attempt to regard disabled bodies as beautiful. Sibbers 2005. For that matter, one might uncover the ways that non-normative bodies and subversive pleasures actually do fulfill various traditional criteria of beauty. Indeed, for some decades there has been a disability arts movement, often associated with artists such as Christine Sun Kim and Riva Laurer, which tries to do just that. See Sibbers 2005. The exploration of beauty, in some ways flipping it over into an instrument of feminist resistance, or showing directly how women's beauty could be experienced outside of patriarchy, has been a theme of much art by women of the 20th and 21st centuries. Georgia O'Keeffe's Flowers and Judy Chicago's Dinner Party place settings undertake to absorb and reverse the objectifying gaze. The exploration of the meaning of the female body in the work of performance artists such as Hannah Wilk, Karen Finley, and Orlan tries both to explore the objectification of the female body and to affirm women's experience in its concrete realities from the inside, to make of it emphatically a subject rather than an object. See Striff 1997. Beauty seems in need of rehabilitation today as an impulse that can be as liberating as it has been deemed enslaving, wrote philosopher Peg Zeglen-Brand in 2000. Confident young women today pack their closets with mini-skirts and sensible suits. Young female artists toy with feminine stereotypes in ways that make their feminist elders uncomfortable. They recognize that beauty can be a double-edged sword, as capable of destabilizing rigid conventions and restrictive behavioral models as it is of reinforcing them. Brand 2000 XV. Indeed, vernacular norms of beauty as expressed in media and advertising have shifted in virtue of the feminist and anti-racist attacks on dominant body norms as the concept's long journey continues.